Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
This is the story Wood of the Wyrm Tree by Rhombus Tix as part of Swamp Castle. Vance the Doomigod knew he had a paranoia problem. The question was, what was he going to do about it? He was going to have to trust someone, and at the moment it looked like it was going to be an utterly incompetent child. Vance looked from the ragamuffin lot of potential recruits in front of him. He wasn't impressed. They stood in line waiting to speak. "What's your name?" Vance asked the nearest. "Brimley, sir," the quivering ragbag announced. "Any useful skills?" "No, sir." "Then why are you wasting my time?" "I want to help, sir." Mimley did his best to look brave. Vance wasn't impressed. "Next." Mimley cried and moved off to the side, his tiny tears running amongst the mud and clay caked onto his face. The fortress was impregnable. Vance had spent over 1,000 years sharpening his skills on half a dozen worlds. If it breathed, chances were that Vance had killed something like it before. If it could use something as a weapon, chances were Vance had wielded it. He had spent all of this time sharpening himself into the perfect weapon that held the weapon, and now it was all for nothing. Vance had spent over a year scouting the place out from every angle. The spells that protected it meant that any kind of supernatural entrance was right out. Teleportation, world hopping, magic transit, and all that really flashy stuff wouldn't work. It also meant that he couldn't see inside. Neither could any of the wizards on whom he'd spent a small fortune. The next kid was all attitude. Vance had seen his kind 1,000 times before. It was the brightest spot in his whole day so far. This kid had bangs over his forehead in a delightfully rogue-like fashion. He wore bright colors and held himself with confidence. Vance looked thoughtful a moment as if he was going to ask the right question. The kid smirked, certain that he had just the right answer to any question that Vance could ask. Vance smirked. He had the perfect question. "Next!" The kid looked shocked and just stood there a moment. Vance motioned him away with the others. The kid continued to look shocked, frowning slightly. How could it be? How could Vance not have chosen him? What had he done wrong? Everything. Duh. The whole point was to pick someone from this village to enter Odingel's stronghold, which meant that the precious know-it-all would be spotted a mile away. Everyone here knew that. This idiot would have gotten himself killed 5 minutes after walking in. The kid spat on the ground and stomped off, making an obscene gesture in the process. Make that 5 seconds. Flashback. The wind made the aspen sway back and forth as Vance looked up into the sky, dying. He hadn't meant for this to happen. His delusions of grandeur had cost him, but not as much as they would cost Lidiania. It was cold, very cold. He looked once more wistfully at the wood. Was it worth the cost? Of course not, he chided himself again and again. The cost was too much, but if it meant saving himself, then he couldn't justify it. But what about his master? Vance looked over at the huddled shroud of black blankets that contained Kilgan's body. He kept looking at the wood. It would be one thing if he burned some for himself. But what if he burned it for his master? Surely that was worth it. Saving the life of another was worth it. And how much knowledge would be lost if Kilgan died? No one else knew the codes and prayers that would unlock the secrets of the World Tree. No one else could even find it. Kilgan had taught Vance some of what he needed to know, but it was only a shadow of all there was. Somehow, he found himself over by the wood staring at it. It was smooth, almost like it was carved, etched with dragon scales so fine they shimmered in the moonlight. It didn't feel like wood, but then again, nothing from the world tree would. Each piece represented a world, a tiny way that the world could be, and this was supposed to be enough to keep the city going for 1,000 years. Supposedly, if he burned the wood, everyone who was left alive in that world would die. But Kilgan had said that they were going to die anyway. He had carefully chosen the ones that would be most likely to go for each use of the city. Of course, that was before the race had attacked. Even if he resisted temptation and refused to burn the wood, he wouldn't know it when it was ready. He went and grabbed a piece of wood. He wasn't sure how it happened, but his body moved of its own accord. He kept mentally refusing to destroy those people, yet his flesh refused to simply lie down and die for a hunk of wood. Vance wasn't going to let that happen. He moved the wood to the fire pit and stood out and took out his fire and steel, or his flint and steel. As he looked down at the wood, he stopped again. It was just wood. It wasn't really people. They were going to die anyway. He had to save Kilgan's knowledge. Vance had to save himself. He deserved to live, damn it. He was no hero. He was here to help his people not die for someone else. One strike of the flint landed on the wood, causing it to spout into flames. The heat was intense, like dragon's fire. The wood didn't really seem to actually blacken or burn, though. Vance basked in the warm glow, and then he heard the screaming. It started out small, a single child of the night, but then it grew louder and became many screams. The roar of sound nearly put the fire out, but the heat only grew greater and greater. All of the snow around him melted, turning the ground to mud. The flesh on his hands burned. With a cry of fear, Vance leapt towards his master, pulling him away from the fire and towards the cold. After walking 100 feet, the temperature finally became bearable, but the screaming did not stop. Vance tried to cover his ears. He discovered that the screaming was in his mind. He couldn't make it go away. Finally, he could stand it no more and tried to move towards the fire to put it out, but could not get close enough because of the heat. He tried gathering up snow in large amounts to throw it onto the log, but this accomplished nothing. Finally, he tried taking out the shovel in hopes of shoveling dirt onto it. Normally, he would not have had the strength to get through the permafrost, but the heat had turned it all to mud. He couldn't throw it very far, but a bit of it fell onto the log, putting it out. Bit by bit, he tossed more mud onto the log until it finally went out. The screaming did not stop at first, but eventually it faded away. Vance knelt down and wept with guilt, holding on to the shovel as he did so, leaning upon it as if it were an absent parent. Then he stopped crying and looked at the shovel's wooden handle. He had an axe. He was surrounded by trees. Why hadn't he tried to chop one down before he used the wood? Of course he knew the answer. Kilgan had all kinds of rules about what they couldn't do on this quest, but did his restrictions about harming a living thing apply to their return? All of the elaborate rituals that they had engaged in preparing meant nothing if they could not return, and had he not already doomed them both by his actions? Vance didn't know, but he had wood that he could burn that would not scream, and that was all he could focus on for now. He drove thoughts of madness out of his head and chopped the wagon to bits, slowly feeding a natural fire that came to life. He made sure that the whirlwood was very, very far away from the rest of the flame. Once they had built the fire and secured the wood, he dragged Kilgan's body closer. All he could do now was wait. Flash forward. The next kid was a stick. It was obvious the kid was starving, and he looked pretty stupid. He kept looking around vaguely as if he wasn't even sure he was next. He just stood there near the front of the line. Vance motioned for the kid to come forward. Hey, you. What's your name? The kid looked around a moment and then pointed to himself. Yeah, you. Who do you think I'm talking to? The stick was silent for a few seconds and then shrugged. You can talk, can't you? Speech is not a requirement for the job, but you'll be annoying if you're a mute. The stick mumbled something vaguely speech-like. Hey, stick, speak up. My name is Zockberry. The kid spoke a little louder. He seemed pissed. You seem upset, Stick. My name is Zockberry. This time, Stick proudly shouted it. Glad to meet you, Stick. What brings you here? Vance took a bite of his sandwich. This kid was amusing. Zockberry. My mother brought me. I didn't want to come. Honesty. Good. Vance took another bite of his sandwich, speaking with his mouth full. What would you rather be doing, Stick? Zockberry. Anything, really. I like watching snails. Really? Do tell. Snails are awesome, Stick said with enthusiasm. Have you ever watched one of them? Can't say that I have, Vance said, finishing his sandwich. But I imagine they're great. Do you know what I want you to do? Stick frowned. Sneak into Oldengel's castle? There's a little bit more to it than that. Yeah, I know. Do you? Vance asked. Do I what? Do you know what else that entails? Vance smiled wickedly. There was a very awkward pause. Vance figured this kid reminded him of himself 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. No. Vance beamed. Great. Ignorance is bliss. He looked up at the others assembled there and motioned them away. You're hired, kid. Stick scratched his head. What do I get paid? Vance laughed. Assuming you survive, whatever you want. Stick looked thoughtful. Anything? Vance smirked. Here, the delusions of grandeur were already trying to enter between Stick's over large ears. Anything in my power to grant, Stick, and that's a lot. Zachberry, muttered, wandering back to his mother on the sidelines. Vance looked at the other kids in line and waited. So did they. Finally he said, "What? I only want one. Go home." They murmured as they left. Most of them had desperately wanted to help Vance out. They all knew what the castle represented, and they wanted to be free. Vance couldn't blame them for wanting to help. Of course, that didn't change the fact that they were mostly idiots. But then again, there were idiots descended from idiots who trusted Odengel with their freedoms in the first place. 200 years was a long time. If it weren't for all the other free nations that they saw traipsing through their corner of the world on a regular basis, they wouldn't have even had a comparison. Vance knew that they all had a thirst for it, though, and that was how he'd been able to get them to cooperate. Vance had other reasons for wanting to take Odengel down. He wanted to end his curse, and that wouldn't happen until he had paid for all the lives he'd taken. That had taken time, but he was finally within viewing distance. He started his quest out with a sense of guilt, but now that he'd lived so long, he understood that death was just as much of a part of the cycle as everything else. Death could be a gift, and it had been denied him for far too long. Odengel was the last of the wood thieves, and now that he had the right child, all of the walls that there ever were would not be enough to save him. Flashback. The old man looked at Vance with a look of pity. "It was not worth my life, you know." Vance shook his head. "Of course it was, master. Without you, we would all been lost. The curse that has blighted our land is passing. The need for the wood is passing with it. In another 100 years, we would have just been fine. This wood is sufficient. This wood would be sufficient. Now," he shook his head sadly, "what do you mean? You are cursed, Vance, and this wood is cursed with you. Many will steal it. Most will come for it, and until you have dealt with them all, you will never be able to see peace." Vance crossed his arms, still weeping. "It was worth it." The old man gently put his hand on the back of Vance's shoulders. "You say that now, but we'll see how you feel in a few 100 years. Flash forward. Vance and Stick looked at each other from across the wagon. Vance looked like an old man, withered and weak. His glamours were sufficiently powerful that he even smelled of ancient flesh and musty medicines. The glamour would have to be to withstand the outer wards. Vance could get by those without any problem, but even he would not dare enter Odengel's inner sanctum. He was mainly coming for the boy's benefit. Stick was nervous and not happy about his designated task. Vance had to force him to memorize over 1,000 instructions with absolute exactitude over the last few months, and the magics had forced him to use only the lightest touch. Stick was not now a magic user in any capacity. He was more of a device, albeit a living, breathing one. He had as much understanding of the arcane bits inside his head than he did understanding how to fly, which was to say none at all. Stick didn't look happy. He was just sullen and silent. It was beyond doubt that he wasn't interested in what they were doing. Even 100 years ago, Vance would have tried to fill the awkward silence with some kind of conversation. But he was just too old for that kind of thing now. He had better things to do. So neither of them said anything to each other until just before they entered the castle. Then it became a matter of vital security instead of sociability. Vance whispered to Stick, "You know what to do." Stick nodded. "You know what to do?" Stick nodded. Vance nodded back and gave the barest hint of a smile. He hadn't exactly been kind to the boy, but he wasn't stupid. By not asking again, Vance was giving him a sign of respect. Of course, sometimes little courtesies helped in matters like this. They also helped make you human. He was old, but he wasn't soulless. So he tried something encouraging, however feeble. "What you're doing is very important." "Yes, it is," said Stick. Of course, they both knew it was. The walls were straight up and solid black. They helped deflect most kinds of serious enchantments unless a wizard was present. It wouldn't stop Vance, of course, but that was why the blood from 6 creatures had mixed into the mortar. It was the most potent mixture yet found, and Odengel had drained the wealth of dynasties to have it built. But it had been worth it to Odengel. Vance cursed himself under his breath. It would be worth it to any man to have eternal life. At least it would for the first century or so. It took a special mentality to last longer than that. Guards in plate armor decorated in ceremonial worm scales stood at attention at the gate. They looked at the cart, but not immediately inside. That was for their brethren beyond the wall. They were merely here to look impressive and sound the alarm if something untoward happened at the front gate. Nothing happened at the front gate. They passed the witch stones as well. It was said that the blood of 1,000 innocent witches had died there. The number didn't matter. Their power did. They were able to see every element inside the cart. Nothing could be snuck beyond their watch. Fortunately, there was nothing there for them to see, just an old man and a stick of a boy. Easiest glamour in the world was to make yourself look like your true self. That was all relative, of course. If you were going by the truth as seen by man, he was an old man. If you were going the way the world thought a man of several hundred-year-olds should look like, then he was still an old man. But if you looked at the deeper truth, the truth of the wood of the world tree, then Vance was an immortal that could never die. Until his task was complete, that was. The market inside the outer wall was bustling. Merchants with trusted sources gated here directly from other worlds. The security of this place was the source of Odingel's power. Everyone knew that it was safer to bring something here for sale than virtually anywhere else in existence, and those places weren't generally safe to get to. Yes, Odingel seemed like quite a prosperous and well-rounded fellow to the untrained eye. To be sure, he pillaged and conquered every century or two when things didn't go well in the market, but what ruler didn't? True, he destroyed the life force of the occasional child to tend his fire, but what ruler didn't do the occasionally horrible thing now and again? From a mercantile point of view, Odingel was perfect because he was stable. You could count on Odingel to do what he said and to say what he meant. Despite all of the bustle and hustle, though, the circle around the inner keep was invisibly enforced. No spell, no clever mechanical device kept people from getting closer than 2 paces away. It was sheer and utter terror. Some believed it was the nightmares, and others believed it was the brutality of the guards that Odingel used from time to time. But Vance knew that it was revulsion that all life felt close to death. One of the guards blew through the hollowed-out ibex horn. It was time. Vance moved Stick around and into the line with the others. Here was where all the preparations paid off, and Vance was finally able to complete his mission. Stick started to protest, but Vance was having none of it. He silenced Stick with a glance. The doors slowly opened. Odingel slowly waddled his portly frame out of the gate and down the steps. His hair was jet black but brittle. The wormwood could only protect him from the ravages of time so much. His beakus nose lifted a moment as if to smell something and then lowered slowly, looking over the assembled children. Without a moment's hesitation, he pointed at Mimley and said, "This boy will tend my fire." How the hell had Mimley gotten here? Everyone in the compound cheered. Vance joined them reflexively as he had been prepared to do with Stick. His brain was stuck in a fog trying to understand the facts and impossibilities as they presented themselves. Fact 1. Odingel had chosen the wrong child. Fact 2. Odingel had chosen a child that he rejected for consideration because he was a brat. Fact 3. Odingel had chosen a type of child totally opposite to what 30 years of observation had told him that he was most likely to select. Stick, on the other hand, was looking very happy as well, quite relieved, actually. Vance exploded. Being a demigod, he was used to spending decades to plan everything that he had almost forgotten about, and then doing a knockdown, and then it ending in a knockdown, drag-out fight, almost. The fireballs that he threw were carefully ringed so that they did not harm the children that were fleeing in a dozen different directions. He did fry many of Odingel's guards. While Odingel was burned, Vance knew that it didn't matter. Sure enough, in a blur and blink of an eye, Odingel was well. Rather than fight, Odingel turned around immediately and ran for the door. Stick looked at Vance and then frowned. At first, Vance thought he was going to run away like all the others, but much to his surprise, Stick ran behind all of the other combatants and back along the wall, but farther into the chaos. Vance didn't have a spare moment to watch Stick any further. He raised his sword to defend himself as quickly as possible. He threw up a wall of flame around himself that destroyed the warriors right next to him, but he immediately had to turn around and burn those that were grouping in larger numbers. Odingel wasn't any kind of sorcerer compared to Vance, but Odingel did have a wide range of enchanted devices. He used those mainly to stay alive. Still, there was a part of Vance's mind that was trying to figure out where Stick had gone. He would normally have had far more awareness of the situation around himself, but the scrying blocks forced him to use his natural eyes. Vance wanted to try and protect the boy, but the fact of the matter was Odingel was his higher target. Most of his spells simply bounced right off of Odengel. And what little damage Vance did was almost instantly healed. Vance was able to make headway towards him. It was only a question of who was faster. Then again, the minions that Vance kept clearing away like insects voluntarily swept aside for Odengel. The danger of focusing too much on the minions was that Odengel would get away. The danger of not focusing on the minions is that one of them would get a lucky shot and decapacitate him or something. That wouldn't mean death, but it would mean making up in one of Odengel's cells with a very unpleasant fate. One by one, the groups came and Vance dispatched them. It wasn't even a contest. It never was. Just as he thought that, a crack pair of heavier magicians teleported in behind him, bypassing the wards and forcing him to shield himself. It took only a few seconds, but it was all Odengel needed to scurry behind his doors. Vance howled with rage and blasted again and again at the gate, but it was for naught. It was only then that he noticed that Stick had managed to sneak his way past him. Time passed, as it was wont to do. He wasn't sure what action to take next. He had a single, simple spell telling him that Stick was alive. Odengel's wards wouldn't detect that simply because it was basic sympathetic magic. When Stick died, the blood charm would turn to ash. And all he could do now was wait. Well, that and prepare layered wards for whatever backup that Odengel was calling. There were things out there in the worlds that could hurt Vance, but none of them was ever going to get here fast enough to get past his defenses. So it was a stalemate, and Vance hated it. He had to create a small hourglass spell just so he could see time pass. There came a point of diminishing returns. There was only so much preparation that was worth it. Beyond that, it was simply a matter of waiting. While it felt like days, his fields got slammed. Because of the stupid scrying wards, Vance couldn't see exactly where they were. He considered upending the wards so he could see, but he didn't feel like it just yet. It was a time-consuming process, and while he was skilled enough to hold the wards and hold his wards and remove Odengel's at the same time, it would be a strain. For all he knew, he might be here for years. The doors opened and Stick walked out. Vance was pleasantly surprised. The kid had survived after all. He felt much better about waiting at this point. The doors slammed behind him. Stick walked up to him, wearing silken robes with Odengel's markings on them. He didn't have any scars indicating that he'd been beaten in combat. "Greetings, Vance," Vance nodded. "I have come bearing a message." Vance waited. Obviously, the boy expected him to say something at this point. It was quite the waiting game until Vance finally decided to say, "Fine." "Odengel wishes to depart from this life." That was more like it. There was another pause. Vance finally realized that Stick was quite enchanted. Then, to amuse himself, Vance said, "Fried chicken." Stick nodded sagely. "Yes. He has 3 conditions." "Sassafras." "He is more than willing to address your concerns, but first you must meet the 3 conditions." "Cat ate your tongue?" "First, you must agree to allow at least half of the mages to enter the fortress." "Mukula bola finu." "Second, you must act as the executor of my state when I'm gone." "Blackberry pudding." "Third, you must do no harm to anyone in the city once Odengel has taken his life." Vance nodded sagely. Stick still didn't say anything. Vance rolled his eyes and placed his hands high above his head. "Hear the words of my mouth." Stick nodded sagely. "Excellent. What are your terms?" Vance figured Stick was going to repeat this from Odengel, so he wanted to make it good. "I want you to come out here, unarmed, with Stick. I'll lower the ward as soon as you're vulnerable." Stick nodded sagely. "I shall convey these terms to Odengel." "Great. I'll wait here then." "Remain here." "Of course." Vance nodded politely. Stick bowed and nodded. He then moved towards the doors that parted for him. Vance was right behind him. The doors closed with a resounding crash, making Vance look around nervously on instinct, but there was no response. The initial hall was richly furnished with 3 gilded chairs, a carpet, and tapestries from a dozen different worlds. It was lit with a ghostly mage light that came from the entire place and making it feel tomb-like. There were several more halls, each was littered with more evidence of Odengel's vicious plunder. Vance had to restrain his anger. He was trying to move by stealth here, nominally speaking. Eventually, Stick returned to an opulent living room. Odengel sat at its center, drowning in silk pillows that overflowed the room. Every moment of the last 1,000 years had been worth it as Vance saw Odengel's jaw drop. Odengel was still for a moment, then screamed, scrambling out of the pillows towards a nearby bell rope. Stick just stood there. Vance leapt over the pillows and slammed into Odengel before he could reach the rope. He put a knife to Odengel's throat and said, "All the protections in the world, and you let them down to let your charmed puppet back through. Not too bright, Odengel." Odengel sneered, trying to push down the rivulets of fat that matched the red silk around him. "If you take my life, the boy dies, and the whole place goes up in cinders." Vance just smirked at him. Odengel waited. "What?" Vance didn't say anything. "What?" Vance plunged his enchanted dagger into Odengel's fat belly. The blade slipped inside the layers of fat, causing problems of its own. Odengel couldn't remove it, though he tried, wallowing and writhing in pain. While he lingered on the floor, Vance turned his attention to Stick. The boy writhed in agony. It wasn't so much that he was bleeding, but Vance could tell that he was in pain. Vance recognized the spell. It was sloppy, but vicious. It took him about 10 seconds to undo the results, but Vance failed to notice the trap until it was too late. There was a titanic explosion with flames reaching high above his head to touch the sky. The walls of the mansion were knocked flat in a matter of seconds. The mages that had been outside ready to trounce him were incinerated. The village that had grown up around Odengel's mound was gone as well. Vance felt the fire crawl up and down his skin like a living thing, burning him beyond recognition, and then there was blackness. He awoke to a barren wasteland. His curse was slowly ended, and death was finally coming for him. Vance should be happy, not only that his time was done, but Odengel and his terrible evil removed from the world. It was the stuff of legend. Odengel had died, and the boy had died, and now he was dying. Everyone dies. But as the final lingering moments of his life appeared before him, Vance couldn't help but feel bitterness of the whole thing. He had succeeded, but used the innocent to do it, however intentionally. That he would have to bring that guilt with him as he moved into the next life. The last bit of wood escapes him, but not before setting the balance right. 2 lives for 1 life. It was a good bargain. Vance felt his ego whittled away as his spirit merged with the world tree. But not before he had a shade of satisfaction as he saw Stick take a breath of life and stand amongst the crumbling ruins of the building. Vance took a second hint of satisfaction as the boy stood up and looked around in confusion. Stick obviously didn't have a clue what was happening. Typical. And then a third came from the fact that the boy bore a small scar on his forehead, a serpent's mark. The wood had marked him with thanks for its service, and the boy would be rewarded accordingly. There were few less qualified, none more deserving. With a sigh and unwilling blink of the eye, the spirit that was Vance at last discorporated, sinking slowly amongst the winding scales that moved between the worlds, up the branches and onto other spheres. Such was the natural way of things. So, I like this story. I'll give it a solid B. I don't think it would be good enough to get out of a slush pile, but it would almost get out of a slush pile and probably get moved from the lower layers of the slush pile onto the higher level reviewers. The thing I like about this story is that it shows that, after writing story after story after story, eventually you get kind of good at it. And while my early stories had flaws, the fact of the matter is that this one, it has 2 characters, technically 3, that you understand who they are. The characters have an arc. You understand their motivations. The story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And there's a conflict. And that's really the best you can kind of hope for in a short story. The thing, like I said, that it just does, to me, it doesn't stand out. I've read and written many, many fantasy or science fiction stories, and this one incorporates a lot, but it doesn't, there's nothing unique about it. So on the whole, I'm glad I read it, glad I enjoyed it, glad I wrote it, but, I'm not going to be remembering this one 20 years from now.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright
2022!
To fight the forces of evil!